Hello everybody, STEM Choir here, and today we're going to be talking about domain and range. So what is domain and range? Domain and range is all of the x and y values in our function, and we have to write that out. So domain is going to be all of the possible x values in our function, and range is going to be all of the possible y values in our function. So now we're going to learn how we're going to solve this and write it out. Let's start with the problem. Here we have a function. In this function there are three sets of points. So to solve our domain, which we're going to start with, we have to look at the first number in the parentheses. So that number is going to be 1, 4, and -3. We're looking at this number because these numbers are the x values. So that's what's going to determine the domain, which is all of the x values in our function. So we've identified all of the x values. So that's pretty much the domain. But now I'm going to teach you how to write it. So to write it, we're going to use two different notations, set notation and interval notation. These two notations are the primary ways of writing our domain and range. So for set notation, we're going to do this curly bracket and then x bar. This basically means the x domain is all the values of, and then we have to write out the domain. So for this, it's just going to be x equals, we want to write this from lowest to highest, so -3, 1, 4, then finish the bracket. That is set notation. So for interval notation, we're just going to do a bracket and then write them out, -3, 1, 4, finish the bracket. We use these brackets because they basically mean that we're including the -3 and 4 in our domain. If we had parentheses -3, 1, 4, that would mean the -3 and 4 are not part of the domain, and the domain would just be 1. So that's not true, that's why we're going to use these brackets. Next we're going to do range. So range is all the y values. The y values are the second number in the parentheses. That's going to be 2, -7, and -3. So that means we found our range. Now it's going to write it in set notation and interval notation. It is the exact same way as our domain, but with y. So I want you to pause this video and try to do it yourself. Okay, now let's do this. We're going to use the curly bracket, y bar, y equals, then write out domain, -7, -3, and 2, and then close the bracket. For interval notation, bracket, -7, -3, and 2. Close the bracket. And that's it, domain and range. Now we're going to move to a graphing problem. Here we have a parabola. So for this, what we're going to do is let's start with domain. So as we can see, there's two arrows here going upwards, and because of the angle, that means it's also going upwards indefinitely and to the sides indefinitely. So the sides is what's important for domain, because domain is going to be this x-axis, or the x values. So because there's always going to be part of the line touching everything to the right and left in the x value spectrum, that means our domain is going to be going till infinity and -infinity. So a -infinity to infinity is really just all the numbers, all real numbers at least. So that means our domain is just going to be all real numbers. Now, we don't want to write this with the brackets and things because there is a symbol for all real numbers, and that's going to be this R symbol with the 2 dots. So for set notation, that's the answer. For interval notation, we're going to do the same thing as before, but we're going to use parentheses. We're going to say parentheses, -infinity, comma, infinity. This basically means from -infinity to infinity, all of those numbers are in our domain. We're using these parentheses because infinity isn't an actual number, it's just a symbol for all the possible numbers. So that's why we're not going to use a bracket. Now let's move to range. Now we have range. As we can see, there's an arrow going to infinity upwards, but there's a stopping point here at -2. So that means it's not going to be the same as our domain. We're actually going to stop at -2, but we're going upwards till infinity because of the arrows. So that means we want to represent, so basically our range is going to be all these values of y going till infinity from -2. So we want to represent everything above -2. So So to do this, in set notation, we're going to go back to our curly brackets. It's going to be curly bracket, y bar. I'm going to say, we want to say all the values above -2, so we're going to say y is greater than equal to -2. We're using this equal to because there is a point at -2, so that means we're including that number as well as everything above it. Then we're just going to close the bracket. For interval notation, we're going to do like straight bracket, -2, comma, infinity, parentheses. Remember, we use this bracket because we're including the number there. And infinity does not need a bracket, so it's going to be parentheses. And that's domain and range for a graph.